Hi, everyone. For those of you whose hands I have not gotten to shake yet, I'm Anna Miller, Director of Education Policy at Idaho Freedom Foundation. So my goal is basically to take the analysis and the diagnosis that Scott laid out for us and to explain what social justice education actually looks like in action. So as a task force, to achieve our goals, this requires us to know what to look for in the education system and then how to identify the presence of this ideology. So those taken by the vision of social justice have a very specific view of the world and a very specific mission to advance that view. And most of us mistake social justice as a set of fringe ideas dealing with socially important issues like racism and sexism. Most of us would also conclude that it's necessary and important for our kids to learn about racism and sexism and our country's history. We trust our educators to communicate truth to our kids so that we can build a stronger society. But this well-intentioned view misunderstands the goals of social justice education for our society and for our students. The mission of social justice education is to awaken people to supposed realities of systemic oppression in society, in other words, to become woke. These people must be trained to see systemic oppression in a particular way. This way is outlined by critical theory. So to be able to begin evaluating our education system, we must understand real-world examples of social justice education in practice. You have to understand what to look for in a curriculum and in our school and universities' practices. So I recommend understanding social justice education as having four main principles. The first is to stigmatize meritocracy. The second is to train students to believe systemic racism is deeply embedded in American society and it's perpetuated by an oppressor group, and that oppressor group is fundamentally and irredeemably evil. The third principle is to instill and enforce a critical consciousness in students and faculty. And then the fourth principle is to train students to become activists to achieve the ideological goals of social justice. So these four practices result in a complete replacement of education with activism. So I'm going to go through some examples as sort of instruction of what to look for. So the first principle, social justice education requires throwing out the liberal idea of meritocracy. This is achieved by training students and faculty to use Marxian conflict theory to analyze society and to split people into groups of oppressors and oppressed based on their immutable qualities like race and sex. An example of this occurred in Cupertino, California, where an elementary school math teacher forced third graders to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities, then rank themselves according to their power and privilege. They separated the 8-year-old children into these groups, oppressed and oppressor. An example that hits more close to home is in a middle school here in Idaho, in Meridian, where officials tried pressuring teachers to judge students by the color of their skin. There was a flyer posted in the school that said it's not enough for teachers to treat all students the same. Instead, educators must recognize students' multiple identities based on race and sex and other immutable traits. The flyer also suggested that colorblindness is a myth, and it perpetuates the idea that white is the norm and everything else is not. In higher education, administrators usually introduce the poison. So for example, at Boise State, the former president, Bob Custra, created a commission on diversity and inclusion, and he issued a report recommending that Boise State begin the process of building a comprehensive institution-wide strategic plan for diversity and inclusion. Custra's commission thought the university must spearhead transformative change in Idaho. Defeating oppression and victimhood became sort of BSU's mission. The report said, our institution and those that lead it have enforced cultural, structural, and personal norms of what success looks like in Idaho and rural America. The true success of a new university in a new Idaho would center on inclusive excellence, achieved through a self-reflective and uncompromised commitment to the practice of inclusivity, which seeks to break from implicit and limiting biases that reify exclusionary practices. The university would replace dominant cultural norms with a more welcoming culture by devising concrete steps to promote social justice. This has manifested as one example in Boise State's hiring practices. Boise State's hiring practices are designed to ensure that diversity, rather than meritocracy, is a key practice to bring in new employees. Boise State offers its employees implicit bias training. Implicit bias training, for those of you who don't know, is basically an attempt to prove to everyone that they're a bigot at heart. So implicit bias training is part of recruitment efforts for new faculty, And best practices are to find candidates who satisfy the minimum qualifications and then allow diversity considerations to guide hiring. Human Resources also certifies all job pools against statistical measures to ensure that recruitment, application pools, interview pools, and final candidate pools are all guided by adequate affirmative action. So practices like these abolish the idea of meritocracy by teaching students that success is based on one's immutable characteristics and hiring faculty based on diversity considerations instead of just hiring the most qualified candidate. So this ideology tries to manipulate people into feeling guilty by telling them they're privileged, and it rejects the idea that we're all created equal and that legal and cultural institutions should treat us all the same by telling people to reject the myth of colorblindness. So the next principle, students must be taught systematic racism is deeply embedded in our society and perpetuated by the oppressor, and that the oppressed is fundamentally racist and evil. An example of this comes from Buffalo Public Schools. The school taught students that all white people perpetuate systemic racism, and it forced kindergartners to watch a video of dead black children warning them about racist police and state-sanctioned violence who might kill them at any time. As one Buffalo school district administrator explained, the solution to this systemic racism is to be woke, which is basically critically conscious. Critical consciousness is a pedagogical concept which developed by a Marxist theoretician named Paulo Freire, and it holds that students must be trained to identify and eventually overthrow their oppressors. So this leads me to my third principle of social justice education, which is to instill a critical consciousness into students. A critical consciousness means students view the world through an identity-based system of power that critical theorists believe permeate and define all of society, which creates injustices and must be disrupted and dismantled to achieve liberation. In other words, students are not trained to think critically. They are trained to think only in terms of critical theories. So for example, consider critical race theory. It poses the question not did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in that situation? Under a CRT framework, instead of being taught how to do mathematics, a student needs to be taught how mathematics maintains racial oppression. This is actually exactly what we see in Washington State's ethnomathematics program, where students focus on things like who it benefits to get the right answer in a math problem. So ensuring a critical consciousness is instilled in both students and faculty members actually requires policing speech to punish anyone who disagrees. A good example of this comes from the University of Idaho and Boise State, who both have bias incident response teams. These teams basically operate as secret police for social justice educators by enforcing the inclusive environment that activists want to build. A bias incident can include any word or action that offends a social justice activist. Intent, as outlined by University of Idaho's own policy, does not matter in a bias incident or in the definition of bias. Students and faculty members are basically used as voluntary informants or snitches, and they're encouraged to report anything that they find for the university to investigate. Students and administrators basically work to arrange for bias and hate crime complaints against anyone who ideologically dissents and is a member of the university. And these complaints lead to administrative investigations that are in themselves a punishment, regardless of the outcome, and can actually lead to expulsion. So finally, the fourth principle, social justice educators must train students to become activists to achieve a fundamentally transformed America. This goal is embodied very well in something known as New Civics Education, or Action Civics. The New Civics redefines civics education as progressive political activism. The largest preoccupation of New Civics is to get students to engage in activism. As scholar David Randall of the National Association of Scholars explains, the transformation sought by proponents of Action Civics includes massively redistributing wealth, intensifying identity group grievance, curtailing the free market, expanding government bureaucracy, elevating international norms over American constitutional law, and disparaging our common history and ideals. The New Civics is epitomized in what is known as service learning. Radicals founded service learning in the mid-1960s to use basically university resources to support progressive nonprofit organizations and to propagandize students and to raise their consciousnesses. For example, University of Idaho has a center known as Volunteerism and Social Action, and it encourages students to participate in a form of service learning known as civic engagement. The center encourages students to take action by participating in an event called Writing on the Wall. This is a project designed to encourage students to divide people into groups of oppressed and oppressor, and then write down these examples on a blank wall. The event ends by tearing down the wall, signifying tearing down oppression in American society. A great example, a hallmark of what a mature social justice education system looks like, comes from Portland, Oregon. So schools in Portland have basically achieved the transformative goals of social justice education. The cities are characterized by riots. They're perpetuated largely by teenagers who are active in some of the most violent anarchist groups in the state. The schools in Oregon have adopted some very radical goals. For example, the superintendent of Tigard School District pledged to become actively anti-racist, dismantle systemic racism, implement a collective equity framework, establish pillars for equity, deploy equity teams within schools, and create racially segregated student affinity groups, and use an equity lens for all future curriculum adoptions. White employees of this school district must attend training sessions on becoming an anti-racist activist and participate in protests, and ultimately, they must be psychoanalyzed for their supposed covert white supremacy. Another example of diversion of education toward political activism in Idaho is a school in Garden City who instructed students to create protest signs promoting social justice. The picketing signs featured Black Lives Matter fist symbols, and they were written by 7-year-olds under the instruction of adults. And they have messages like, "From now on, I can change gun laws by protest at the Capitol to make people safe. And right now, our city, I can speak up for Black lives." A teacher at the school also leaked that students were shown a cartoon video promoting Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is an organization with self-described Marxist leaders and very radical political goals. For example, they want to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family. So this video, set to a cheerful tune, features BLM fists and logos and cartoon images of a white child being mean to a black child, and it encourages children to be hyper-aware of race. In higher education, diversion of education toward political activism requires not only silencing any dissenting views, but actually sanctioning them. So a great example of this comes from the Big City Coffee scandal. In October of 2020, Sarah Fenley, who's the owner of a small business known as Big City Coffee, was told by activist administrators controlling Boise State that their presence on campus was a symbol of white supremacy and anti-blackness. This was in response to a small blue thin line sticker placed on the coffee shop's downtown location. Fenley supports the police because her fiance is an officer. He's a heroic police officer, and he was shot 5 times on the line of duty and is now in a wheelchair. Activist administrators told Fenley and Officer Holtry that they would not protect the small business from the, quote, firestorm heading their way, suggesting that radical students were planning protests and could destroy the business's property on campus. This intimidation and harassment resulted in Big City Coffee being forced to leave Boise State's campus. One administrator at Boise State, Francisco Salinas, stated, and I quote, "This could be the beginning of a revolution where we say that we have a standard for corporate partnerships that we have." The student government at Boise State even impeached its student body president on the allegation that he supported extending Boise State's contract with the police. Fenley's and the student body's president support for police basically ran afoul of the dominant ideological dogma at Boise State. In the case of Fenley's story, the very presence of a diverse opinion was enough to bully, intimidate, and harass the small business off campus. This is basically the epitome of how critical theory looks for oppression hidden in unlikely places, even when it doesn't make sense. The vision of social justice in our education system is therefore a deliberate attempt to make sure that students think only in terms of cynical and pessimistic ideology. The goal is to make students woke, to make them believe the purpose of studying society is not to understand it, but to change it. And this is happening all over the country, with many universities and schools that are much farther along than Idaho. But we should not want Idaho to be on that path at all. So investigating the depth of this agenda in all of our educational institutions and developing policy recommendations to stop this is the goal that I think this task force should set for themselves. So I'm happy to take any questions or open things up to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, committee, do you have questions? Laura, go ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you said, and you kind of breezed over the meritocracy based on Marxian conflict theory. Are you able to expand that? Because this is Marxism, all of this, and with BLM, and my own opinion that I'm sure that many people that I've talked to share, that we are in a Marxist takeover, a communist takeover of this country. And this is a manifestation of it. It's in our face. It's in our homes. So I think it would be really helpful for you to expand on your Marxian conflict theory and how that has manifested into all of the rest of everything you talked about, please.
Sure. Thank you for your question. So I would not say that social justice critical theory is a Marxian theory. I would say they applied Marxian conflict theory to culture. So they took the Marxian dichotomy of the oppressed and the oppressed, and where Karl Marx would have put in class, critical race theorists, for example, put in race. Intersectional feminism kind of understands it as a sex problem. So I wouldn't say that it's directly a Marxian theory. It does have Marxian influence that it applies to culture. Like, for example, they do adopt this idea that the purpose of understanding society is, or the purpose of studying society is not to understand it, it's to change it. That's one of Karl Marx's very well-known ideas, and that's definitely applied in this ideology as well.
Thank you. Isaac.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Will you be providing this task force with any of the documentation or evidence that you have cited regarding what's happening here in the state?
Yes, absolutely. So everything that I already discussed in this, I reproduced a report at the Idaho Freedom Foundation and partnered with the Claremont Institute to study University of Idaho and Boise State. Those are 30 to 40 page reports that are available on our website. Some of the information I used in here, or all of the information that I used in here, is in those reports, and there's a lot more information too. And then the information on the particular schools, that's also on the Idaho Freedom website. And if the chairwoman is okay with it, then I would be happy to send that around to everyone.
Thank you, Isaac. And I think as we gear up into the next sessions and during these breaks, we will pass out contact information for all the committee members, and then we can start sharing resources. I know Anna has authored a lot of articles and reports, and instead of overwhelming you with all of that data here, this is an avenue to network, get to know each other, meet people, and then now we can start to dive into all of those resources. So thank you very much. Next up, I think it was Joseph.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And along the similar lines, would ask that right now I feel like the people that a long time ago when Mozart first started composing, too many notes. I'm hearing a lot. There's so much going on, and it's once you stand back from it, begins to have deeper meaning. So if there's any way that, in particular with our presenters today, to have a unified focus, if those notes could be shared specifically, we can continue with our own networking. Thank you for that opportunity. But if, as a part of the whole process as a unified group, if the notes from each presenter could be shared, I would greatly appreciate that. Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And Mark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Anna, thank you. One of my concerns, to be honest, about being on the task force, and I think it was someone by the name of Beth that I spoke to. What I basically expressed is that I don't want to participate in what I called a witch hunt. And she said, this is definitely not what that is. I am very interested in identifying the good and identifying what right looks like. And I think there's a ton of educators out there, administrators, may be watching this thinking, yeah, I know that stuff's out there, but that's not us, not on our campus. And so I know there's examples out there of what is wrong in the system. Do you know of any specific examples, either just from conversation or things that you've learned from the media, of schools that are already kind of keeping their finger on the pulse to make sure they're providing a filter to make sure this doesn't come into their curriculum or into their campus. Do you know of any good news stories that you could share?
To my understanding, the topic of critical race theory of social justice is so new that a lot of administrators don't know how to defend against it. It may already be in their curriculum and they don't even understand or know how to identify it. One really important point that I want to make is that when these things happen in a school, it's not necessarily the fault of an individual educator. You can think about how these ideas infiltrate schools in basically two ways. You can talk about bubbling up or infiltrating down. So it could be that there is an individual educator that deliberately thinks critical race theory is something that students need to learn about, and then they would teach about it. But there's also, for example, in Idaho, there are state standards that require that every single teacher, in order to teach in a public school, has to be certified in what is known as culturally responsive pedagogy. And this is a pedagogical standard that was developed by Gloria Ladson-Billings. She's a critical race theorist. The standards specifically cite Ladson-Billings, so this is also being imposed from the top down. Now, we don't know how deep this is in our education system yet. We're just beginning our evaluation of it. But again, none of this is to denigrate any particular teacher. It probably is not even their fault in many instances. And this can come from the state level government, it can come from the federal government. Sometimes it can come from a particular school and come up from the bottom. But I think especially in a place like Idaho that is increasingly rare, and it's often something that's imposed from the top down.
And I'm going to go ahead and throw a question in there. Maybe you can talk through some of the definitions, as we were talking about earlier. When we say teachers aren't quite sure what they're seeing yet, can you maybe throw out some of those? I mean, the white fragility, the intersectionality, just off the top of your head and what you're seeing in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the social justice buzzwords you can look out for are things like culturally responsive teaching, anti-racism, white fragility, anti-bias, things like this, racial equity, racial justice. These are all terms. A lot of them sound very, very good. Like, how could someone be against anti-racism? But these words have been reconceived of. Just like the words diversity, equity, and inclusion have been reconceived, so have all of these other terms. So anti-racism, for example, which is basically the same thing as cultural responsiveness, is the idea that racism is a uniquely white problem. And so educators in a particular school are often forced to go through things that are called anti-racism training. So I have a good friend at a Title I school, not in this state, but they spend a lot of time on anti-racism training. And basically in these trainings, they're telling people how to move, they're telling people what to say. One great example of an anti-racism training is known as a privilege walk, where they actually line up faculty members and they have them basically rank their sexual and racial identities and power and privilege, and they basically have to admit complicity to things like racism and sexism that are unlikely to be true of those individuals. So that's one example. So anytime you see those buzzwords, it's likely these divisive ideas are being taught in a school. It's not guaranteed, but it's very likely. And again, words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are kinds of the hallmarks of social justice, they've been redefined. So diversity should be considered under like an American understanding of the idea that we all have different faculties and traits. We should be able to exercise those different faculties according to our own needs and what will bring us happiness. But now diversity basically means anti-white and anti-male. So that's just one example.
Ryan.
Yes, thank you, Anna. That was a great presentation. I have some questions about solutions, and being that this is the first session of this task force, that's probably way too soon to talk about practical solutions, but I'm going to be brazen enough to ask you to talk about that very briefly, to just start those juices flowing in the minds of this task force. And hopefully by our final session, we will have some good concrete solutions. And I would reference first HB 377, which forbids the teaching of many of these ideologies in Idaho public education. But I don't see any teeth, and I don't see an enforcement mechanism. And what other area of our legal system do we provide a prohibition and yet not provide an enforcement mechanism? And Dr. Yenner pointed out that up to $20 million were proposed in the 2021 legislative session for social justice ideologies in Idaho education. Is this a dollar amount? Is this an enforcement structure? Is it an agency? Can you give us ideas on where solutions might lie?
Yes, so there's a lot of different ways to approach this, and we certainly need to have a much broader discussion about this, so I don't want anything that I say to be taken as a task force should definitely do this, but these are all ideas that we could talk freely about, and there's certainly a lot of solutions out there. So when it comes to K-12, so you mentioned House Bill 377, I believe it is. So you're correct, that bill does not have any teeth. What it says is that public universities and schools cannot compel students to adopt certain divisive tenets of critical race theory and that they cannot expel money to do that. There is no real enforcement mechanism in the bill. With or without the bill, a parent could file a lawsuit saying that critical race trainings in schools are violating the Civil Rights Act or free speech, things like that. But this bill does not have any particular enforcement mechanism, and that's a problem, and that's something that should be looked at in the future. Another problem with that bill is that it does not apply to protect teachers. And teachers are often, I don't know how many in Idaho or how rampant it is, but I know that anti-racism training and cultural responsive trainings in schools are a common thing across the country, and many educators are forced to undergo that. And so we need to protect those teachers to make sure that all of our teachers are not subverted to a pernicious ideology as well. Ultimately, the solution for K-12, though, is not banning an ideology. It's not banning books. It's things like school choice. It's empowering parents to make sure that their kids can get an education that suits their needs. It's making sure that families can send their kid to a school that suits their values. Ultimately, I don't think that tax dollars should be used to promote an ideology that is pointing to our own country's demise. But I believe that reform in the education system, the K-12 education system, certainly begins with school choice. The next thing that you mentioned is the spending that's happening at the universities on these. So the $20 million number, that is a very low estimate. There's a lot of factors that we could not evaluate, but that was a good starting point. And the way you got those numbers, is by looking at all the different bureaucracies on campus. So things like bias incident response teams, things like gender equity centers, things like LGBTQ centers. All of these things add up to make a very big number of expenditures at the university. And so we looked at all these different bureaucracies on campus. We looked at certain departments that were completely overtaken by critical theory. Critical theory is kind of like an infection. When it gets into a certain field, it starts to destroy the whole thing. So we looked at departments that we judged to be mostly or completely infected by those ideologies, and that goes into that number as well. So again, $20 million is an underestimation, but it was a place to start.
I'm going to jump in here. Anna, you may have mentioned it and I didn't type quickly enough, but can you give us your definition in all your studying of what critical race theory is?
Yeah, absolutely. So critical race theory is an academic discipline that developed out of the Frankfurt School of Marxist Critics in 1930s. Scott gave a little bit of a different definition, which I think was a very strong definition as well, but maybe this will help bring it down to earth a little bit. So critical race theory basically imposes the question of how did racism manifest in that situation? It doesn't ask, did racism occur? It assumes that it's already there and then it goes to find it. It also promotes some very harmful ideas, like, for example, Ibram X. Kendi, who's a critical race theorist, and you can read this in his book. He talks about how discrimination against white people is a positive social good. He talks about, a direct quote from his book is something along the lines of, we need present discrimination to counteract past discrimination, and we need future discrimination to counteract present discrimination. So they want to solve the problem of present discrimination with more discrimination, or past discrimination with more discrimination. Another thing to note is that critical race theory is, by its own definition, unlike traditional civil rights methods. It wants to ascribe certain qualities to certain groups of people based on immutable characteristics. So for example, the civil rights movement, you can look this up. You can look up the words, I am a man. There are images of men marching in the civil rights movement, holding up signs saying, I am a man. They just wanted to be recognized as a human being. I'm sorry, I have a cold. They just wanted to be recognized as a human being. And the new critical race theory, what it says is that, no, you need to be your skin color first. And so that is one way to define it.
Jim, go ahead.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Anna. I want to ping on what Mark was asking you and just ask if you are aware of any schools or otherwise environments where this kind of teaching, this kind of practice has gotten a foothold and that they have recovered, that they've managed to come out the other side.
No. This ideology has been growing and growing and growing for years, and it shows no sign of slowing down. I haven't heard of a particular school that's stopping it. I've heard of parents speaking out. and winning lawsuits and things, but I don't know if there's a particular school that's reformed, not in Idaho, but I mean across the country. This is something that people are just learning to identify, and it's kind of snuck up on us. So I wish I had a really happy story for you of an example. I have examples of Portland, Oregon, where this thing has grown to maturity and it's wreaking havoc on their society. But no, I don't really have a positive example. I think that's something we have to fight for the sake of our own country, of our own civilization. So.
Let's see. Throw your light on. Did you have your light on? Laura, throw your light on. And then let's go with Michael. Thank you, sir.
No?
Yes.
I was just wondering if your foundation has ever studied the genesis of funding for this type of, for the theory, for the pushing of this into the schools. Has there ever been a study or any type of investigation done regarding how this is funded through the schools if it's not publicly funded, and how they spend their money on this to what groups? A lot of times I've seen in my area of work where somebody who supports something like this will develop some foundation, will develop like the groups on campus you were talking about, and then they'll use public money to fund these groups. But these groups, the people who are running these groups are really using that money to push the theory or push the agendas further than what we would know publicly, right? They're using it for purposes other than what is it's being allotted for. So long question short now. Are there any studies showing where this money comes from and where it goes and where it ends up?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know of any particular studies on that come to mind. Idaho Freedom Foundation has not done a study like that. Maybe that's a question we should take up as a task force to see maybe what outside groups are affecting our school system. Could be something interesting to look at, but no, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Laura.
So has the Idaho Freedom Foundation come up with a plan, a template for parents to be able to, how they can go talk to the school boards, talk to the school administrators and say, we don't want this in our school. Our kids are coming home and saying the teacher told us to walk like a girl. A little boy would say that, and the boys would say, yeah, they taught us how to walk like a girl, or I don't want, and these are real stories. After Martin Luther King Day, the little boy came home and said, I don't want to be white anymore, or I'm ashamed of being white, and because, that whole thing. So anyway, so parents are becoming aware where I'm from, but I want to be able to bring to them, this is what you can do, this is how you do it, who you can talk to. Has your group developed anything like that? Because if it hasn't, this is, I think, what we need to do. But we don't need to reinvent the wheel if you've already done it.
We have not done that yet. At Idaho Freedom, we would like to develop some tools to help parents and teachers, for that matter, to identify these things, to understand them, and to understand how they can fight back against it, different methods they could use. We don't have a resource like that at this point, though.
Okay, thanks.
Did you have one? Okay. And the committee here this afternoon, we're going to pass out just a blank sheet of paper, and everyone's going to be asked to define critical race theory. You don't have to have your name on it. It's just kind of, from today, what in your mind do you think it is? But I'm wondering, and your topic specifically is more about social justice ideology. And so I'm wondering, on that piece of paper as a committee, do you think we should try to identify just critical race theory, or maybe we should also throw in there another word? Because there's lots of terms that we're dealing with here. And do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so I have a recommendation. So when we talk about social justice ideology, we're actually talking about a large body of literature that is from the 1930s of Frankfurt School, critical theory. Social justice ideology actually describes the body of theory stemming from critical theory. And so it's things like intersectional feminism, queer theory, critical race theory, and many other things. So it's a whole body of literature that we're talking about when we talk about the term social justice ideology. It might be beneficial for us to focus on critical race theory because that is one particular thing we can target. It's a hot topic across the country right now, so I don't see anything wrong with focusing on that, but people should understand that critical race theory is just the leading edge of the social justice movement. It's just one small piece of it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Professor Yunner.
I mean, I have a comment on the definitional question. To me, the problem with CRT as a way of framing a debate is its exclusive concern about the R and the ignoring of the C, if I can put it like that. Because there's other ways in which this approach to understanding manifests itself. So just to use a very simple example, transgenderism is part of critical theory. It's attempting to break down our understanding of binary sexual differences. So we take a critical approach, or I should say, those who embrace the ideology take a critical approach to the idea of sex, and to people who think there are two sexes, they want to say, no, there's kind of a fluid understanding of what gender is. And that's a critical approach. If we focus only on CRT, we miss other avenues and other places where the same ideology comes up. So to me, if we want to use the framework of critical theory, we call it critical theory and it manifests itself in different ways. Critical theory is a way of approaching truth. Social justice is the end game. And that's the new kind of society that is being sought to build. And so, I mean, I think they're very compatible with one another. It's just that there are different sides of that coin. And we have used social justice ideology in our combined work, Anna and I, because it focuses on the end game. And all of these schools of thought that you hear bandied about, identity politics, critical theory, critical race theory, multiculturalism, all embrace the end game of social justice. And that's why we've embraced it. And but I mean, I'm not opposed to any of it. Just to be clear, I'm not opposed to any of it as far as how to frame it. And that's not my question. So that was just, I'm sorry, it was just a comment, but I once again have a microphone, so. I think that one of the things that we've been caught aback, we're caught off guard, caught with our pants down, is understanding how the education systems work. And we hear a lot of people say that there's a particular classroom or particular teacher that are doing things, or we hear things like school districts are adopting particular standards. We also hear things that there are state standards, and Anna mentioned this, that encourage particular kinds of engagement. And we also hear that there are federal grants that come with strings to teach particular things. So we have these four actors: the federal government, the state board of education and the education department, school districts, and schools. And there's some relationship to those among those things. There's like arrows pointing down from the feds to the state, and from the states to the locality, and from the locality to the school. And well, what goes along with those arrows? Well, one of the things that goes along with them is money, right? And that was mentioned. It's a funding mechanism. But there are other things like accreditation, and that also go down from the top down to the bottom. In order to be accredited by the state, you have to meet certain standards. In order to be for your degree to be worth something and recognized by universities, you have to adhere to particular things. So I think we have to be careful in thinking that this is only at a school level, or only at the school district level, or only at the state level, or only at the federal level. That I think we don't understand how it all works and how it all fits together. But we have to put these puzzles out or these puzzle pieces in front of us and try to see how they're arranged with one another. And it's great that we have members of school districts and teachers and former state board members here that can begin to give us some sort of understanding. We also have, so I think this is a very complicated thing, and it should be really our job to think through how all parts of this fit together.
Thank you, Scott. I'm just going to remind the audience that we had already set decorum standards earlier, and we again asked that no signs be in the committee rooms. That is a standard in this entire building. If you're not going to remove your sign, then I'm going to have to ask someone to help escort you out. But please remove the signs again at this time. All right. And security, would you just help us commandeer the signs? Thank you. All right, Brooke, if you will help me, please. We need decorum in the committee room to respect the process in our republic. Thank you. So, Brooke, if you would help us go ahead and just put out, sure, and Madam Governor had a question for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and Anna. You mentioned this, you talked about this as the discussion of critical race theory, really going back to critical theory, and talking back to the where this all originated back to the 1930s. And I love studying history. This may put you on the spot that maybe you're not prepared to respond to this, but could you just, if you're prepared, could you elaborate a little bit more on the history of this movement going all the way back to the 30s or even into the 70s?
Sure, yeah, so I'll say a little bit. So critical theory, critical legal theory, which is the grandparent of critical race theory, developed in the mid-1930s in the Frankfurt School of Marxist Critics. It's people like Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse characterized this movement. One really important thing to understand is that it's heavily influenced by postmodernism. And what that means is that critics in this school of thought do not believe in objective truth. They believe that this Western idea that objective truth exists is basically an oppressive force. And so what happens in universities where these ideas have grown, when these ideas should have never been given credence to in the first place, they've been given sustenance and they've been allowed to grow. And now they have entire fields, but they're not building on objective truth. They're not starting from an objective standpoint. They're just building ideology on top of ideology. And that's how you get things like grievance studies and idea laundering. If that helps.
Okay, thank you. Committee, maybe we just take a minute to dialogue amongst one another. I think from what I've heard, maybe let's just define critical race theory, unless you want to also define maybe critical theory and critical race theory. And this is more just for our own kind of use going forward and nothing official, but any input on that?